Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and I'd like to welcome you to the Practical Stoic Podcast, where I give you practical Stoic advice for modern times. If you'd like to learn more about Stoicism, or if you want some added inspiration in your day, just go to my website. It's risetothegoodlife.com. If you're interested in transforming your life with Stoic principles, then I also offer one-on-one coaching. To book your first free session, just head to risetothegoodlife.com/coaching and follow the links. But for now, enjoy this episode. Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and welcome to the Practical Stoic Podcast. And welcome to a very special episode where we once again have an incredible person on the show who I interview, and I'm so excited to welcome Massimo Pigliucci to the show. And so before I get into the interview, I'll tell you a little bit about Massimo. So apart from having the coolest name that I've ever heard, he also has some incredibly impressive credentials to his name. So I'll read a little bit about him. Massimo Pigliucci is a professor of philosophy at the City University of New York. His research is concerned with philosophy of science, the relationship between science and philosophy, and the nature of pseudoscience. He received a doctorate in genetics from the University of Ferrara in Italy, a PhD in botany from the University of Connecticut, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Tennessee. He has published over 100 technical papers and several books, including one that many of you will definitely know called How to Be a Stoic, which is also the name of his blog, which many of you will also be familiar with. And so just from those credentials, it's easy to see that Massimo takes his education and his learning very seriously. He's an incredibly smart person, and I'm so lucky to have him on the show. So, without any further ado, I present to you my interview with Massimo Pigliucci. So Massimo, when I first told my audience that I was going to start doing interviews on this podcast, I asked them who they wanted to hear. And almost immediately, I had many people asking your name as somebody who they wanted to hear from. And, I've already read a little overview of who you are, but for the very few people who may not know who you are or what you do, could you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm flattered. Thank to your listeners for that. So my name is Massimo Pigliucci. My official title is the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. My background is actually a mixed one. I started out my academic career as an evolutionary biologist, which I did for close to 25 years. And then I had my midlife crisis, decided to change field, went back to school, got a PhD in philosophy, and I've been a professional philosopher since. And my specialty within philosophy is philosophy of science. And then a few years ago, I got involved, in part because of what I refer to as my midlife crisis. I got interested in Stoicism as a philosophy of life, and I started studying as seriously as I could. And now this has become actually a major part of what I do. I write a lot about Stoicism. I keep practicing every day, and I try to be helpful to other people.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And, I wanted to start the interview with a bit more of a personal question than might be expected because, I'm really interested in where people grew up and how that area affected them as they grew up, how it shaped them as a human being. Because, personally, I know that if I had have grown up in a different place or in a different time, I would be a completely different person. And as I understand, you grew up in Rome, in Italy. And so I was really interested in knowing, how do you think that growing up there affected the person who you are today?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, it's difficult to answer because it's not a controlled experiment. It's just one's own impressions about things. But and of course, the other bit of it is that it's not like we're influenced only by the place where we grew up, but also and especially by the people we grew up with. And I was very much influenced by my grandfather, for instance. I grew up with him, not with my parents. And he had a major impact on my life very, very early on. In fact, he saw, for instance, my budding interest in science, and he nurtured it. He started buying books from me about, science for kids. And, he bought my first telescope when I was 7 or 8 years old or something like that. So those are major things that would have happened or might have happened any other place, not necessarily in a big city. But what a big city does to you, I think, especially a city like Rome, is, first of all, you're always in direct contact with history. You cannot walk in the streets of Rome without passing a church that is several hundred years old, the Roman Forum, which is 2,000 years old or more, the Colosseum. There's history and art are everywhere in a city like that, and that kind of it sends you sort of a constant subliminal message that those things are important, that history and art are important. It's a completely different thing, for instance, in New York City. I mean, I didn't grow up in New York City, but I imagine that somebody who grows up here clearly will get the message that art is important. New York hosts some of the major art museums in the world, but not so much for history, right? I mean, what New Yorkers call history for Romans is like the other day. So it's not quite the same thing. So I think that to some extent, and I don't mean this to disparage New York. As I said, I love New York as a city, but it's just a different kind of place. And so the emphasis, especially when you're growing up, when your brain is pliable, it does make a difference. The other thing about Rome is that it's got very good public schools. And I'm very grateful to a number of my teachers from beginning with elementary school, and I still remember their names and their faces, in middle school, high school, and then eventually college. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Rome. And I really was lucky enough to get a lot of good teachers. And they all made an impact one way or the other. Even those that I didn't realize at the time. For instance, in Italy, you had to take 3 years of philosophy in high school. And when I did, it was a fun subject, but I would have never imagined that at some point later in my life that would become my profession. And yet, I think that part of the reason it has become my profession is because my teacher of the time was wonderful. She made the subject come alive. She engaged us in constant discussions, and it was just a wonderful experience. So all those things clearly do shape you in one way that might not have happened or would have happened very differently in another place.
Yeah, absolutely. And so thanks for indulging me in that question, because I was really interested, because I can't even imagine growing up in a city so full of history like Rome, and especially now being completely in love with this philosophy of Stoicism. There would have been so much to see and so much to do. And I can move away from that now, and I wanted to go back to Stoicism, because I think that everybody has their own idea of what Stoicism is. And so I'd love to hear from you. What do you think Stoicism means to you? What does it mean for your life?
That's a great question. Stoicism for me is a compass. It's a framework by which you can sort of look at life and make sure you have your priorities straight. That you make the right choice as much as it is possible for a human being to do, an unwise human being, a human being who's not a sage. So I think that's true for philosophies of life in general. I mean, whether you're a Stoic or you practice Buddhism or even some number of religions, every religion comes with a philosophy of life embedded. If you're a Christian, you do have a philosophy of life. I mean, a philosophy of life, after all, is essentially, it's mostly about what the ancient Greeks and Romans called ethics. Right? So the ethics was the study of how to live your life. And every philosophy and every religion has a component of ethics in that sense, in that broad sense. Usually they also have a component of metaphysics. They tell you something about how the world works. They have a component of epistemology. They tell you how you know about this stuff, and so on and so forth. In the case of a religion, often the epistemology comes down to, scriptures. God says so. In the case of various philosophies, it depends on whether you're a Buddhist, a Stoic, or something else. But most importantly, I think what every one of these things has in common, these activities has in common, is their framework for your life. Now, since I've been practicing Stoicism, now pretty much every time that I make a decision, small or large, in my life, I tend to think about it like a Stoic. And which means that there are two fundamental questions that come to mind. One, is this a virtuous thing to do? And if not, then probably you shouldn't do it. And B, is this under your control or not? And if it is under your control, be careful what you do. If it is not under your control, be careful not to attach too much yourself to the outcome, because things may not go the way you want them.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's a perfect description of what Stoicism is to you, and I think a lot of people will feel the same way. And I love that sort of metaphor of the compass for your life. I think that's perfect. And so, as you know, this whole podcast is all about the practicality of Stoicism. And so I'm sure that my listeners would love to really know how you've used Stoicism in your life. So could you maybe give us just one or two Stoic practices that you've found to be most useful in your own life?
Yeah, the first one, and for me the most important one, is the evening philosophical diary. So I, just like Seneca and Epictetus say you shouldn't go to bed before having sort of collected your thoughts about the day that just passed and analyzed the major things you did in terms of three questions. What did I do wrong? What did I do right? And what could I have done differently? So the idea is to ask yourself, what did you do right? Because if you did something right, then you want to pat yourself in the back. You did the right thing. Remember it. That was the right thing to do. If you did something wrong, the point is not, of course, to indulge in regret, because the past is outside of your control. So there's no point in sort of indulging in things like regret. But you do want to learn from your past, especially if you made a mistake. So writing it down, I think it does help me. It's a way of admitting to myself that I did something wrong or not quite as right as I should have. To learn from it. And then the third one is really important. It's like, what should I have done differently? Because a lot of human situations really kind of repeat themselves, if not identically, pretty close. We tend to go through life by doing almost always the same things. You deal with friends, with relatives, with your children if you have them, with your coworkers, in my case with my students. You tend to do a number of things, to have a certain number of interactions that are pretty much the same throughout your life, or they change a little bit, but they're not that different. And so, if you ask yourself, what could I have done differently? That means that you're, in a sense, not only learning from your experience, but you're preparing yourself for the next time to try to do better, right? And the goal is not perfection. I mean, as Seneca says at one point, perfection is not the idea. The idea is to get better than yesterday, better than that. And if that's your goal, then I think you can achieve it. So the most important practice that I do is that one. I do start the morning with a meditation of another kind. I open one of the ancient texts, typically, obviously the three big ones, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, or Seneca, but occasionally also Musonius Rufus, or a fragment from one of the earlier Stoics like Chrysippus or Zeno. And I have a collection of these to make things easier. So when I read these books, I highlight them and then I sort of copy the bits and pieces that I find that interesting. And every morning I pick one of those, just a sentence or two, and reread it, and then think about how it applies, or it may apply to my life. And I've been doing this for a while, and then now recently I turned that actually in a mini podcast. I figured this may be useful to other people, and so it's called Stoic Meditations, and you can find the links to the iTunes version and the Google Play version on my blog howtobeastoic.org. But the point is, it's a 2-minute meditation where I read a passage from Epictetus, Marcus, etc., and then I sort of think aloud about what that passage means. So those are kind of the beginning and the end of my day. And those I tend to do every day pretty much. The evening diary I almost never skip. And the morning meditation, I do it at least 5 or 6 times a week. Other than that, there are, certain other things that I tend to do weekly or occasionally. Some of my favorite ones, some of the ones that I find more interesting, are these mild exercises in self-deprivation. So once a week, for instance, I fast. Once a week, I abstain from alcohol in the evening, which I tell you, for an Italian, having dinner without a glass of wine, it's not an easy thing. So it may sound like nothing, but and I'm not an alcoholic, but it's a cultural thing. Uh-huh. So, you do this kind of thing, or take a cold shower, or going out in the cold without a coat, that sort of stuff. These are exercises that you find in Marcus and especially in Seneca. And the idea is interesting. So it isn't obviously to feel bad, make yourself feel bad. This is not a self-flagellation kind of thing. These are fairly mild exercises. You're not doing anything major in this case. But they serve a couple of different purposes. First of all, they're exercising endurance. So you're basically showing yourself that you can do it. Yeah, sure, I could take a cold shower. Yes, I can go a day without food, and so on and so forth. It's something that I can do, and so it increases kind of your self-confidence in your ability to endure things. But also, and more importantly, I think it's an exercise in gratitude, because once you fast for a day, then the next meal really tastes good, even if it is a very simple meal. When you take a cold shower, the next time you take a hot one, you're really grateful. You say, "Whoa, this is really good." So these are exercises in gratitude. And you can do exercises. Lots of philosophies suggest gratitude as a regular thing, but often that just turns out to be a thought. A prayer, for instance, or something, repeating to yourself. I'm grateful to have this and that and the other, and that kind of becomes a little rote and a little sort of predictable and that sort of stuff. If you actually do it, as opposed to just saying it, on the other hand, I think it's much more effective. And so that's one of my favorite things to do for Stoic practice.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all that. You just packed so much value in there, and I know that the listeners are going to take a lot away from that. I just want to echo something that you said earlier on, which was that the goal is not to be perfect, but the goal is to be better than you were yesterday. And I think that so many people need to realize that. And, people in the Facebook group that I have to do with the podcast often ask questions like, how can I see better results faster? Or, I don't feel like I'm progressing. And I think that's an important message. Your only goal is just to be better than you were yesterday.
It's not a race. You're not in competition with anybody, including you. You're just trying to get better. The analogy, I think a good analogy that the Stoics would be pretty comfortable with is with going to the gym. Now, you can go to the gym to become competitive, right? If you're an athlete, a professional athlete, then you have to go and improve on a certain schedule in a certain way, because otherwise you're not going to be competitive, right? You're not going to get to the Olympic Games. But most of us don't go to the gym because they want to compete in the Olympics. Most of us go there simply to feel good about our body, to become a little healthier, to maintain, aerobic capacity and muscle tone, that sort of stuff, right? And that, to me, I think is a better analogy with the practice of Stoicism. You don't go there to become a sage, because there's no Olympic competition for sagehood. You just go there, you do these kinds of things in order to become a better person. And there's, nothing is as sort of problematic for these kind of efforts as setting your bar too high. Because then, inevitably you will slip. Inevitably you will make a mistake. Inevitably you will go through a day or a week or even a month where you don't feel like you're making progress, and then you're just going to give up. So it's much better to sort of lower your bar, just like Seneca did. Better than yesterday. That's all. But if you do that every day, it accumulates. It's like, if you will, the difference between going on a diet, and just to use another sort of health analogy, it's the difference between going on a diet, a crash diet, and adopting a healthier lifestyle. If you go on a crash diet, you might lose a significant number of pounds over a short period of time. But more likely than not, statistics are pretty clear. More likely than not, you're not going to be able to keep it up. You let it go, and eventually you will actually regain all your weight and then some. That's not a good way to do it. You get discouraged, you get frustrated. So now you not only regain your original weight, but you also feel like a failure and you get depressed about it. A much better thing to do, which is what any sensible doctor suggests that you do, is to change your frame of mind and adopt a healthier lifestyle. A healthy lifestyle just means, at least slightly smaller portions, better food, stay away from certain kinds of food or from certain ways of preparing food, and so on and so forth, until it becomes a habit. Now, that still means you may slip, one day or another. Sometimes you go out with your friends and you drink a little too much and you get that, second helping, or you get these French fries that are definitely not good for you. That doesn't mean you're a failure. It just means you're a human being. You get up the following morning and you say, that was a little excessive. Let's try to stay away from that for the foreseeable future, and you're fine. It's much better, much healthier way, I think, of going about life, both in terms of sort of your physical, fitness, as well as, of course, in terms of Stoicism, your mind, the fitness of your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great analogy to use, especially seeing as so many people who are listening to this will be on a diet right now, and or they will be trying to get fit in the gym. It's a perfect analogy, and you can use this with any principle that you're trying to use in your life to do with Stoicism. And
yeah, that's right. I mean, it's not by chance. I mean, I've been dealing with weight control for my whole life as well, so it's like I know what I'm talking about, and really the turning point was a number of years ago when I realized, because I read about this stuff. I read research about dieting. I read research about so the psychology of it, not just the medicine or the nutrition part of it. And I finally clicked in my mind that no, you're never going to have those develop those six packs, whatever it is, abs that people go about doing. But that's fine. That's not the goal. The goal is to be healthy, and that's a much more reachable, much more reasonable goal, and it avoids all that frustration that we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And I was wondering if I could ask a question based on something that you wrote in your book. So your book called How to Be a Stoic. I know that many of our listeners will be aware of this, and they've probably read it as well. And I would highly recommend that they go out and get it. I'll put the links in the show notes here. But something that you mentioned at the start of the book is that one of the ultimate questions of life is, as you put it, how do we best prepare for the final test of our character the moment when we die? And so I'm interested, how do you think about death, and how has Stoicism informed that view?
Oh, that's a great question. So Stoicism has definitely altered my view on that. When I was younger, I used to be slightly obsessed with my own death. Not to an unhealthy point, I don't think, at least. But the thought of dying came up often in my mind, sometimes several times a day, or at least several times a week. And it was not a pleasant thought. It was not the kind of thing that I sort of cherished or really wanted to think about. The idea that my conscience was going to be annihilated one of these days, is going to be annihilated one of these days. The situation hasn't changed. Was definitely sort of worrisome, and I knew that kind of thinking was not healthy, and I tried to stay away from it. But it's like trying to stay away from something. From a particular thought is the best way to actually invite that thought, right? So the classic example is, right now, try not to think about a white elephant, and it's not going to be possible because I just told you about it. So you can't do anything but thinking about a white elephant. Then, of course, early on, before I actually turned to Stoicism, I run into Epicureanism, and Epicurus does have a very healthy attitude toward death. His famous argument for not worrying about being dead is that whatever she is, meaning death, you are not, and vice versa. Whatever you are, she is not. So why are you worrying about it? And from a logical perspective, it makes perfect sense. It may take some time to kind of internalize that thought, but I think Epicurus was right. Now the Stoics wrote a lot about this, and actually they pretty much agreed. Seneca particularly pretty much agreed with Epicurus. In fact, Seneca mentions Epicurus a number of times in his letters to Lucilius, to his friend Lucilius. But the Stoics really thought a lot about this stuff, and they thought about it in a way that I think is much more healthy than anybody that I've heard of, with the possible exception of the Buddhists. I think the Buddhists also have a very similar attitude toward not just death, but a number of other things. There's a lot of similarities between Buddhism and Stoicism from an ethical perspective, even though their metaphysics are very different, and their epistemologies are very different. So what that did to me is, especially reading Seneca, but also Epictetus to some extent, and Marcus Aurelius, it really gradually changed my attitude. And now I think of, death is what it is. I'm a biologist, so I know that death is a natural process. It's a natural occurrence. That's it. In fact, it's a natural occurrence that makes possible life to begin with. If other people had not died before I was born, there wouldn't have been much space in this world for me to come around and do my things. And so I need to leave space to the next generation as well. I have my daughter, for instance, and of course other beings, even though they're not related to me. In fact, Epictetus has this really beautiful metaphor in the Discourses, what he says: treat life as you were a guest at an inn, at a hotel. You walk in, you enjoy the amenities, you enjoy the food, you do what you do without bothering the other guests too much. And when it's time to leave, you leave. You don't just say, no, I want to stay because there's another guest and your room is already booked. I think it's a really nice metaphor. And now Seneca is very concerned about this idea of sort of preparing yourself for that moment. He thinks that it's the highest. It's going to be the highest test of your character. And to some extent, I think he's right. Of course, you have to remember. We have to remember that he was writing in a time where violent death was very likely. Sure enough, he committed suicide because of an emperor, an order from the Emperor Nero. So presumably, most of us, hopefully, most of us are not going to have that kind of experience. Our death may be because of a disease, it may be for other natural causes, maybe for an accident. But it's unlikely that we're going to die because an emperor tells us to commit suicide or because of war. In some cases, it may still happen today. These kind of things still happen today. So Seneca was particularly sort of worried, or I shouldn't say worried, but sort of thoughtful about this kind of thing because his situation was different. But even for us today, dying, the process of dying is the one that's really going to test our character. I don't think it's death itself, because once death has come, as Epicurus is absolutely right, we're not here anymore. And in fact, Seneca has a beautiful passage in his writings where he says, don't worry about what happens to you after you're dead. Don't listen to all these superstitions that the poets have invented. There is no such thing as the underworld. There is no such thing as damnation and all that sort of stuff. That doesn't exist. You're just not going to be there, period. You're not going to feel anything. Therefore, there's not going to be any you left over, and therefore there's nothing to be worried about. The problem is, what we really worry about is the process of that. Right? It's the last moments, it's the last weeks, the last months, for some of us, unfortunately, the last few years before that happens, right? Depending on your health conditions and all that sort of stuff. So in that sense, I do think that the process of dying is in fact a test of character, because at some point you will know that that's you're reaching the end of the line, and you have to prepare yourself mentally for it, but at the same and accept it and manage the process as best as you can. At the same time, you still have, I think, moral duties toward other people. You still don't want to be cranky toward people that are helping you. One of the things that it's pretty well known is that the health professions, especially in terms of taking care of the dying, they have a very, very high turnover. People quit very often, and that's because they get a lot of abuse from dying people. And we tend to think like, well, what do you want? They're dying, of course they're cranky. Of course they're going to be abusive. I don't think there's any of course about it at all. Because you're dying, fine. That's a natural process. It's you should be able to accept it and to manage it with grace, just like you would accept and manage with grace anything else. And so you don't really have a moral right to take it on other people, to abuse, especially if those people are actually there to help you. And so it's I think in that sense, definitely. The process of dying is a test of your character. If you're going to be able to handle it well, then you're pretty good. Then your training as a Stoic was actually paid off.
And something you said earlier really made me think that you might have a really good perspective on what I'm thinking here, because in modern times, these times that we're living in right now, there's so much discussion about companies coming out with these technologies that will allow us to live for well over 100 years, maybe even over 200 years. everybody wants to live longer. I always go back to Seneca's quotes where he's talking about it's not the length of your life that matters, it's how good the life is that matters. But I wonder what you would think if we were all given this chance to live to 200, 300, 400 years old. Do you think that people would become more productive and they would achieve more in their life? Or do you think that the fact that there's so much of this life would actually lead us to becoming more lazy and to not really, we would begin to take for granted our lives? What do you think would happen?
I'm going to bet that for most people, it's going to be the latter. A lot of people that have done a lot of stuff actually have done it over a fairly short period of time. Mozart is the classic example. He died very young, and yet he wrote more music and more beautiful music than lots of other people have ever done in their life. And you do wonder. The thing is, you wonder about all these people who want to be immortal, and then they don't know what to do with themselves on a Saturday morning because they're bored to death. Now, that said, I think it's natural for human beings to want to prolong their lives, and I don't think there is anything inherently wrong. There's certainly nothing immoral about it. But I do agree with Seneca that the important point is what you're going to do with that life, not how long it is. And most people, a lot of people, don't even think about what they're doing. They just get into a particular life track because that's just the way you do in that culture, or your parents told you to do so, or your friends are pushing you in that direction, and you do a certain number of things, almost going through life as an automaton without really thinking about what to do, what you're doing, and why you're doing it. Socrates famously said that the unexamined life is not worth living. That may be pushing the point, but I do think that there is certainly a value in examining your life, at least from time to time. You certainly don't want to spend, a lot of your life examining. You need also to live it and to do things with it. But from time to time, sort of stepping back and thinking about your priorities. That's why I said earlier that Stoicism is a compass for life. Any philosophy of life is, right? It gets you your bearings, and it helps you figure out what kinds of things you can do without and what kinds of things are actually really important. There's also another dimension to this. Fine, sure. Of course, if somebody came and offered me, a life extension of another 100 years, I would probably take it. In fact, I'm pretty sure we'll take it. But there are consequences to that as well, right? It's not just a question of how you would use that extra time. And I think you're right that you did hit something interesting there. There is this thought that if life becomes very, very long, almost to the point of immortality, then it might actually take the length itself may actually take away some of the incentives that we have. I mean, we live our life, some of us at least, live our life with urgency, precisely because we know that it's finite. There's a large philosophical literature on immortality that often makes this point, even outside of Stoicism, that often makes this point that a very long life kind of begins to lose meaning. It's like, so a metaphor that I often use with my students is imagine you're going to watch a really, really good movie. The kind of movie that you get to the end after, it's a long movie, it's like 3 hours long, and yet at the end of the 3 hours you say, oh, damn, I wish I knew what was going to happen to this this character and how that's going to develop, and why couldn't they have done it a little longer? Fine. So let's say that somebody grants you another 15 minutes of that movie, right, or 30 minutes or an hour. Like you can go home and get the director's cut, which is longer. At some point, the movie, no matter how good it is, will become boring. You're not going to be able to watch the same movie if it's going to be weeks long or months long, or years long. And it's kind of the same with your life. I mean, you have to sort of wonder about, there's, in theory, there is a large number of things we can do in life, of course, and there's lots of things that we don't get to experience because we don't have enough time. But at least that's the argument that many people make for a significant life extension. But I wonder if that's really true. I mean, there is a lot of things that I have not experienced in my life, and I could rattle out a list of a few. But then whenever I think about it, it's like, well, it's not I didn't experience them because I did not have the means. I mean, I'm not rich, I'm not wealthy, but I have decent means to do pretty much whatever I want. I can travel, I can try out one thing or another, and it's not like I don't have the time. I can make the time. If I'm interested in something, I'm going to make the time. And so more often than not, it turns out that you don't get to do certain things, not because you don't have the means or you don't have the time, but just because you don't care enough. It's not that interesting for you. It's like one of those things like, would it be nice to, I don't know, have a vacation on the beach in the middle of Polynesia? Yeah, maybe. But, frankly, I could afford that. I could have done that many times over, and I've never done it. Evidently, it's not a priority for me. Right? So it's not a sufficiently high priority to do it. So it's a good question to ask yourself, what would you do with that sort of extra time, and how would you profitably employ it? And finally, there's one more thing, which is a prolonged lifetime affects other people. So, especially in advanced societies like ours, where we consume a lot of stuff and put out a lot of garbage and pollute a lot and all that sort of stuff. If we take space for another 100 years or 200 years and so on and so forth, that has implications for other people. Both other people that are already born, because we pollute the planet, and other people that are not born yet. And so one needs to think in terms of, if there ever is going to be a significant life extension. I don't mean just living longer, by a few years or a decade. That we have already done. And in fact, it looks like modern medicine has pretty much hit the ceiling or close to hitting the ceiling as far as natural biological life span for human beings. Human beings don't live more than 100, 120 years. That's the maximum that we've ever registered. Even if very healthy, if your genetic makeup is near perfect and so on, so you just don't get any more than that, right? And most of us, of course, get significantly less. But you have to wonder if there is going to be any significant life extension, like a doubling or tripling of the lifetime. Then there is going to be societal consequences, and this has to be a conversation that society has to have. It can't just be up to individuals to do that sort of thing, because it's like, there are consequences. There's also an issue of access to these technologies, right? So who's going to get the new technology? You want to bet who's going to get them? The rich and the wealthy are going to get it first. And do we really need, the rich and the wealthy to also, on top of that, be, living centuries and having even more influence that they already have on the functioning of society? So it's a really complicated issue. I think that it has so many different aspects to it. As I said, I'm not against it in principle, and I probably would take advantage of it, at least within limits, if offered, given the possibility. But I do think that this is not a no-brainer. I mean, a lot of people at least, seem to think that, well, of course it's a no-brainer. Of course, that's an unqualified good. I don't think it is an unqualified good. I think it needs to be very much qualified.
Yeah, and I think that this might actually be a good point to go into a segue to another question that one of my audience members wanted to know from you, because obviously a huge part of Stoicism is understanding that we have a very short time here on Earth, and so we need to make the most of that. And part of that is, having goals, having a vision for your life, and finding a purpose to fulfill here on Earth while you are here. And at the same time, there's also a large part of Stoicism that says nothing is guaranteed. No matter how much work you put in, you might not achieve this because you are controlled by fate, ultimately. So it'd be interesting. I'd love to know from you, how do you think about that balance between having a purpose and also understanding that nothing is guaranteed?
I think it's one of the most liberating things about Stoicism, right? We all have plans, and we're all worried about the future, as we should be. I mean, we need to plan for things, and there are things that we want to achieve. There are projects we want to pursue. But we all are under this complete illusion that we will have time to finish those projects. That it's going to be a lot of years before I die. We don't know that. Statistically speaking, of course, we can know that, a white male in North America right now has an average lifespan of, I think, 77 or 78 years or something like that. So I am 54. I can say, reasonably speaking, I have another couple of decades plus to go. But that's only statistically. I could die today. I could walk out of my apartment at the end of this podcast. Some crazy guy is going to run me over with a car and that's it, done. It could happen. And that one of the things about Stoicism is that it frees you from this kind of illusion that you're going to have an infinite amount of time. Very few people take their own death seriously. And they certainly don't take the possibility that they might die today seriously. But if you do, this is not sometimes people think that Stoicism thinking in this direction sort of leads to sort of morbid indulgence on thoughts about death and all that. It's exact opposite. It's to me at least, it's a liberating thought, because it tells me that, you know what, you do what you need to do and what you want to do and try to do your best, and that's it. You're not attached to the outcome. So I'm in the process of writing a new book, for instance, right now, right? And I would very much like to have the time to finish that book. I would like to see it published. I would like to get back on your podcast and talk about it next year, whatever it is. Hopefully that will happen. If it doesn't happen, well, that's too bad. The universe decided it wasn't going to be. And who am I to oppose the universe? It's like it is what it is, as a good friend of mine keeps reminding me of, who is not. And once you internalize this thing, because everybody understands the thought. I mean, it's, if you talk to people and you tell them, look, you realize that you might die tomorrow. Of course, they will agree. I mean, this is just a factual matter. But there's a difference between understanding a thought and internalizing that thought in a way that it actually alters your perception of things, your behavior, your attitude about things, right? And that is why, by the way, I think Epictetus is right when he says that Stoicism is mostly about practice. Because, understanding the ideas is not that difficult. Anybody can read Seneca, even without having any specific background in Roman history or in philosophy, and you understand most of what Seneca said. You may miss one or two of the references to particular individuals, and then you can look it up on Wikipedia, and you're good. You can read Marcus Aurelius, you can read Epictetus. There's lots of good translations, and unlike a lot of other philosophers, these people really did explicitly write for the common person. They wrote in a way that was understandable by somebody who was not so steeped in certain aspect of philosophy. In fact, Epictetus at one point tells one of his students, if you came here to sort of learn the intricacies of Chrysippus' logic, you're in the wrong place. Chrysippus' logic is important only insofar as it helps you to live a better life. If you're interested in, for logic's sake, if you're interested in sort of doing some kind of logic chopping and engaging in arguments for the sake of engaging in arguments, then you're wasting your time. Don't come here. But that means that the ideas are kind of easy to understand. In fact, some of them are kind of commonsensical, right? I mean, often when I go around and talk about Stoicism, somebody comes up and says, "But isn't that common sense?" I say, "Yeah, but you'd be surprised how infrequently that common sense is actually put to practice."
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's the point. That's the real difficult part of it. It's 5% theory and 95% practice.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. Yeah, I know that's going to be really helpful for my listeners who wanted to know that from you. And on to another question that is equally interesting to me and also to my listeners. In these modern times, we're having many conversations online that can become heated about politics or religion or anything that we're facing in these modern times. And I wanted to know, how would a Stoic approach, for example, an online Facebook debate? How would they go about that in the most effective way in order to not, turn people away from your opinions, or in order to actually make the most out of that experience, as opposed to what we see so often, which is people just getting angry and nobody changing their opinions? How would you think about that?
Oh yeah, for sure. That's a big deal. So, couple of things. First of all, of course, the Stoics for the Stoics, getting angry is a bad thing, and so now that doesn't mean you should avoid discussions, because we're a member of a society, and we have a duty, according to the Stoics, to participate in a society, including trying to educate other people and engage them in discussions and things like that. So it's not a question of withdrawing to avoid anger. That's what an Epicurean would do. One of the major differences between Epicureans and Stoics is exactly that the Epicureans realized way before Facebook and Twitter that if you engage in political discussions or in political activity, you will get angry, you will get into emotional pain. Basically, you will cause yourself emotional. And since the Epicureans thought that the best thing you could do in life is to stay away from pain, then it follows that they explicitly said, you shouldn't engage socially or politically. For the Stoics, however, it was kind of the opposite. They thought that a major aspect of human nature was precisely the fact that we're a social animal, that we're all interdependent from each other, and so that we have a moral duty, I think, to engage in discussions, to engage politically and socially. But the problem, as you point out, is that then there's all sorts of negative consequences of these things. So the way I usually approach, I have a similar experiences, obviously, both on my Facebook page, on Twitter. I was just discussing something sort of political, social with somebody just a few minutes ago before you called. So my attitude is this. First of all, I take it as an exercise in self-control. Mm-hmm. One of the Stoic virtues is temperance, self-control. So it's actually an exercise. It's like, okay, let's see if I can manage today's discussion without getting upset or trying to do it without upsetting others. You don't go there because you want to piss off other people. You want to go out with a good attitude and good intentions. That said, of course, a second one of the most important Stoic ideas come into place immediately, which is the dichotomy of control. Certain things are under your control, other things are not. Mm-hmm. Your opinions are under your control. Other people's opinions are not.
Yeah.
So you can influence them, of course. You can try to influence them. You can engage other people, and you should, as I said. But always with the idea well firm in your mind that very likely you're not going to succeed.
Yeah.
Okay. So and you shouldn't get upset about it. Right? It's like you should get into a discussion with the notion that probably you will not change somebody else's mind, at least not immediately. Because people, there is also a lot of psychological research done on how and why people change their mind. And it's very rare that people change their mind simply because somebody points out to them that they're wrong.
Yep.
When was the last time that somebody told you, hey, you're wrong about this? And you said, oh, yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
You're correct. Right? It just doesn't happen, especially if we're talking about things that are highly emotional. If you're really invested into a religious position or a political position or ideological position of any sort, then you're very unlikely to change your mind on the spot. That doesn't mean, however, that you will not change your mind. I can occasionally on my blog, actually, one of my two blogs is called Footnotes to Plato. And occasionally, every few years, I actually put out a post where I document in which cases I change my mind about major issues. Mm-hmm. Philosophical issues or political or social, whatever it is. And I do that because to demonstrate that actually people do change their mind, even when they are highly opinionated, because I recognize that I'm a pretty opinionated person. Mm-hmm. But opinionated usually comes across as a negative term, but it isn't if you actually thought about stuff. If you may have strong opinions for no particular reason, in which case you're opinionated in the bad sense of the word. But you also may have strong opinions about something because you actually thought about it for a long time. Mm-hmm. It's years of reading and discussing and so on and so forth. So you may have strong opinions simply because you actually thought about this stuff for a long time. But people do change their mind even when they hold strong opinions. The thing is, it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen, instantly. It usually requires multiple exposures from different sources, and then some time to process that information. And then people at some point might say, that was actually good. So do not expect to change other people's minds on the spot. That doesn't mean you're wasting your time. Mm-hmm. In some cases you are, and it's usually pretty clear. And when that is the case, when somebody tried to, troll me or bait me into responding in a certain way of posting things that are provocative for the sake of being provocative, I simply don't respond. I don't engage. Or if I do, I simply respond with a short comment followed by a link or two to a source that actually rebuts the point or that provides a counterpoint. And that's usually I do that not necessarily for the sake of the person that posted, but for the sake of everybody else in the audience, right? I mean, I have a little bit more than 20,000 followers on Twitter. So if I respond to somebody, it's not like that person is the only one that sees the response. I adopt the same policy on my Facebook page, the official one, not my personal page, where I friends and family. But there's a kind of official page if you're interested in my activities as a philosopher, and also on my blog, it's the same idea. I mean, when I respond to somebody, I don't respond only to that person, because one-on-one correspondence usually is not very helpful, especially in a public forum, because people kind of have a tendency to take sort of the grandstand, to take positions that are extreme, things like that. So you don't really do it with the purpose of changing your mind. You do it with the purpose of educating or helping other people thinking about this stuff. So I think that the Stoic approach actually is perfect, because A, this is a practice of one of the four virtues, temperance, and B, this is a constant reminder of the dichotomy of control. And so if you go into it remembering, so Cicero gave a very good metaphor for the dichotomy of control. He said, think about an archer who wants to hit a target. The archer has everything under control up until the moment the arrow leaves the bow, right? Mm-hmm. So he can practice a long time to get it right. He can focus at the moment, before letting the shot go. He can pick the best arrows and take care of the bow. But then once it's done, once he lets go, then what happens, whether he hit the targets or not, is up. It's not up to him. The target may move. There may be a gust of wind at the last moment that ruins a perfect shot. That sort of stuff. And so what you should do, according to Cicero, is to go into these kinds of things with the idea that hitting the target is chosen but not desired, meaning it is what you want to do, but you don't attach yourself emotionally to that outcome. If you hit it. If not, well, you did your best, and that's all that anybody can do. You can't do more than your best. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so glad that we got to hear your answer from that, because it's something that is so applicable to today's society and everything that we're doing now. And I know that so many people will get value from hearing that answer, because it is something that we do almost every day. We have discussions with people on Facebook or online, and it does get heated. And so it's really cool to hear a Stoic perspective of how to deal with that. And Massimo, I want to be respectful of your time, so I just have one more question for you, and it has to do with the fact that, with every philosophy, there are going to be aspects of that philosophy that just don't necessarily stand the test of time. And, it's the same with Stoicism. Obviously, there are some things that might not be so applicable to the 21st century. And so one of my listeners asked if I could forward this question on to you, and they wanted to know if there are any aspects of Stoicism that you think need a more modern interpretation, and if so, how would you move that forward?
Yes, in fact, I do spend some time in the book and on my blog talking about that sort of stuff. There's an entry that I published in the blog recently that's called, What Do I Disagree with the Stoics? Yes, of course, it's a philosophy that is, a couple millennia old, and it needs to be updated. And there are people that are in the process of doing that. I mean, I'm trying to do my little part. People are interested in it. Probably the most serious modern thinker about Stoicism in terms of updating it to the 21st century is Lawrence Baker, who's the second edition of his book, A New Stoicism, just came out a few months ago. And I've run a 10-part series, I think, on my blog to discuss Larry's book. So there are people who are doing this kind of thing, but also, Don Robertson, for instance, Bill Irvine, and a bunch of the modern Stoics people are aware of that, and they're working in that direction. But this is not just Stoicism, right? I mean, Buddhism is also almost 3 millennia old, and it's not that today's Buddhism is the same as was practiced 3,000 years ago. Christianity is 2,000 years old, and it's not like modern Christians believe everything that Christians from 2,000 years ago believe. So this is, I think, pretty much valid for every philosophy or religion. Now, I do think that, however, Stoicism has withstood the test of time pretty well in fact, very well in terms of the ethics, which is the most important part. As you know, the three areas of study, fields of study in Stoicism are physics, logic, and ethics. Right? The physics was really actually all of the natural sciences and metaphysics. It's basically understanding the world as it works, as it actually is. The logic was not just formal logic, but also rhetoric, so the ability to communicate with other people, as well as sort of informal reasoning and what we would today call psychology and cognitive science. And that was studied so that your mind would be as sharp as possible in order to arrive at the best judgments as possible. And then finally, the ethics, which is really the crux of the thing. It's the most important part. It's how to live your life. So the general idea was very sound, was that in order to live a good life, you have to have some idea of how the world works, and you have to be able to think reasonably about it. I think that 3 areas, the ethics has survived pretty much intact. I mean, I think the Stoics really got it right. And, they didn't have the advantage of modern psychological systematic studies, but a lot of modern psychology, modern science actually, neuroscience actually backs up the intuitions that the Stoics had about human psychology and human behavior. So the ethics has stood up to the test of time very, very well. I don't think there is a lot that I would change in it. Mm-hmm. The logic is pretty well as well. Stoic logic, the Stoic logicians were very advanced. They made a lot of improvements over Aristotle's classical logic. And in fact, Stoic propositional logic was used up until it was the standard in logic throughout the Middle Ages and up until the 19th century. That is beginnings of modern logic. And even with modern logic, there's nothing really that contradicts what the Stoics were saying. It's just an improvement and enlargement and complication. But it's not like the Stoics were really wrong about the logic part. On the physics, on the other hand, I think that a lot of the details they did not get right, and as you might expect, because they were writing 15 or 17 centuries before the scientific revolution. So obviously things about the universe that they didn't know. I can give you an obvious example. Chrysippus thought that the mental capacity, the logos of the human being resides in the heart, not in the brain. Well, clearly he was. There's no question about it. So try to somehow justify Chrysippus is like, it's nonsense. It's just, it was wrong, period, end of the story. But it turns out that the parts that they were wrong about in the physics are actually not as crucial. They were right pretty much, I think, on the important parts of the physics. And the important part of the physics, according to the Stoics, was that everything is made of matter. It's material. It's made of stuff. There's no spiritual stuff. There's no supernatural thing anywhere, even though they did talk about God, but God for them was the same thing as nature, the same thing as the logos. And so they're materialists, which is a position very much in agreement with sort of modern science. And more importantly, they thought that everything was connected by cause and effect, which is very much a modern scientific attitude about things. So those things survive. But a lot of the details of the physics, I think, need to be revised, and they're not. But there's not much to worry about, I think, there in terms of actual practice. The more theoretical parts of Stoic physics don't actually affect the ethics very much. Now, the major thing probably that I disagree with the Stoics, the ancient Stoics, their theology or their metaphysics, if you like. So they were pantheists, right? So they thought that God was immanent in the universe. He was. God, in fact, is the universe. It's the same thing as the universe. We're literally bits and pieces of the universe. But they thought of the universe as a living organism. Right? So when Marcus Aurelius, for instance, uses the metaphor of, remember that you are a foot that is part of a larger body, and the foot might not like to step into the mud because it's unpleasant. But if it realized that the only way for the body to get home is to step in the mud, then it would do it gladly, right? So this is a beautiful metaphor, which is used by the ancient Stoics, and it makes sense if you think of the universe, in fact, as a living organism of which we're all parts. That view of the universe was alive and well until pretty much at least the 17th, 18th century. So this lasted for a long time. Modern science doesn't think of the universe that way. First, we had Galileo and Newton that moved toward, and Descartes, for that matter, that moved us toward a mechanistic view of the universe. So the universe is a machine. That one also has gone out the window already. Modern physics and modern biology doesn't think of it that way. The universe is just a complex thing, and it's regulated by universal laws. But it's not like there is a plan. It's not like there is providence. It's not like things happen for a reason. Things happen for a cause, meaning that you can have reasonable explanations of why things happen, but not because of there is any universal plan. So I think that you do lose, in that sense, an important component of ancient Stoicism, which is the idea of providence. But so be it.
Yep.
If that's the way modern science works, I mean, even the Dalai Lama, within the context of Buddhism, said, if modern science contradicts some precepts of Buddhism, then so much the worse for Buddhism. You gotta update your beliefs accordingly. And in fact, one of the things that I really appreciate about the ancient Stoicism, this may be a good way to end the conversation, is that they were very much aware of it. There is a beautiful passage in Seneca, in one of the letters to Lucilius, where he says, look, our teachers were teachers, not masters. He was referring to Chrysippus and Zeno, meaning that we followed them because they were wise people, smart people that thought very carefully about stuff, but they're not masters. They're not infallible. And then in the following sentence, he goes on and say, there's a lot of truth out there that nobody has discovered yet, and new generations will, and it behooves us to change our mind if new generations come up with new notions. So there's this idea built into Stoicism that the philosophy has to be dynamic, it has to be updated with human knowledge, because after all, an important component of Stoicism is that it is about human reason. And human reason, since we're not wise people, we're not sages, we have imperfect knowledge. And is anytime that our knowledge improves, our understanding of the world improves, then we should, in fact, I think we ought, ethically, to update our positions and our beliefs accordingly.
Yeah, I can echo what you're saying there, and I also think that this is a really beautiful place to finish the podcast, because that is such a beautiful part of the philosophy, their love of wisdom and knowledge, and their recognition that we're not always going to be right. There are going to be new truths that are found. And so I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show today and being so generous with your time. And absolutely, next year, once you've finished your book, please come back on the show and tell us about it, and we'll have another conversation, because my audience is always here ready to listen to what you have to say. But before we go, could you just tell everybody where they can follow you? How can they get involved in what you're doing?
The best way is to follow me on Twitter. The handle is @mpigliucci, MPIGLIUCCI, or on my blog, howtobeastoic.org. Awesome.
So once again, Massimo, thank you so much for coming on the show, and we'll talk again very soon.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, so there you have it, our interview with Massimo Pigliucci. I really hope that you guys enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed interviewing him. That was just such a great experience. He's such a smart person and has so many incredible perspectives on life, and some great advice there for how we can really apply Stoicism to our modern lives. And so once again, I hope that you guys enjoyed that. If you have any other people that you would like to hear interviewed on the show, then please reach out to me and let me know who they are, and I'll do my best to have them on. But anyway, I'll talk to you next week. And until then, I hope that this episode has helped you on your rise to the good life. Ciao. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. I hope that you've gotten a lot of value out of it, and I hope that it helps you to live a better life. If you have enjoyed the podcast, then don't forget to subscribe so that you'll be the first to know when there are new episodes. If you really love the podcast, then I would appreciate a positive review, whether that's on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever else you listen. Don't forget that if you're interested in one-on-one Stoic coaching, then you can head to risetothegoodlife.com/coaching to book your first free session today.